In this news roundup of the week for the 26th of January 2024, we are hovering on the edge of war with Russia, according to one retiring general, and that should sort out how we should mobilise our people with urgency. And it's not just the UK where such messages are now being repeated. The European Union has been found not to be following its own strict rules on the approval of pesticides, which is unleashing a flurry of action by environmental groups trying to ban glyphosate. And the tide is rushing back against the electric vehicle revolution in all countries apparently, including the big driver of uptake in the technology, China. Is it a major shift or just a temporary setback? The UK is hovering on the edge of war. Reportedly, General Patrick Sanders has told the UK government that it should mobilise the nation to prepare with war with Russia. Now, this wasn't a call for conscription, he said. By and large, the UK military has supported for decades the setup of a professional army rather than a conscripted one. But nevertheless, there is a need, he said, for a shift in the mindset of the British public to be mentally ready for a hot war with Russia. To that end, Britain should train a citizen army ready for a land war.
Who do you think you are kidding?
Within the next 3 years, he said, it must be credible to talk of a British army of 120,000 folding in our reserve and strategic reserve. But even this, he said, would not be enough. We are changing, he said, from being a post-war generation to being a pre-war generation. Ukraine brutally illustrated that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. One might counter that the brutality of Ukraine is that citizen armies don't necessarily win wars either, but it's a work in progress, so let's stick to the optimistic take for now. Now, it's not only the UK that has been hearing this sort of talk. Last week, the German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said that a Russian attack on NATO could come in 5 to 8 years. One of the top NATO officials, Admiral Rob Bauer, likewise called for a war-fighting transformation of NATO. Now, what's going on, you might ask? Such messages don't get sent out for no reason. The obvious answer is that after many years of enjoying what was always billed as the post-Cold War peace dividend, those responsible for military forces are coming to terms with a massive reality check, which is that those forces have become significantly depleted compared to what would actually be required were we to end up in the worst-case scenario. Not only do we have so many fewer warships, so many fewer planes and tanks, not to mention so many fewer modern drones than we might wish, but also the resilience, stoicism and basic fitness of the population has degraded to the point where we think that mean jokes are violence and microaggressions are something that should never be tolerated. Realistically, in practice, this is more a call for military budgets to begin to be built up, for larger professional forces to be trained, than it is de facto any suggestion that the Netflix-watching masses will get their call-up papers tomorrow. But it's an interesting check. If the world's greater tendency in the last few years towards armed conflicts, if that really does come directly onto our own backyard, how would you move a population from the utter complacency of a status quo where that was seen to be impossible to one where you had to rouse the population to deal with it? To judge that, you might note the shock and the outrage that the comments actually provoked. It's not obvious that particularly the Generation Z youngster fed an unending diet of how terrible their country has been through history would feel that there was something worth fighting for, even if it came to that. The government clearly did not welcome this intervention. A spokesman said that it was, quote, unhelpful to debate whether Britain was strong enough to fight Russia in the event of a war. They added that the government has invested significant sums into our armed forces. So that's all right then. Significant sums. That should certainly make Vladimir Putin think twice. However, in spite of those sums, the number of full-time trained personnel in the British Army has fallen from 100,000 to 76,000, with the number expected to fall even further to 72,500 by 2025, according to the Ministry of Defence. Writing in The Telegraph, Isabel Oakeshott contrasted this with a situation in famously neutral Switzerland, which remains keen on its sense of preparedness. Compulsory national service, meaning that all able-bodied young men spend 18 weeks at boot camps learning how to use weapons and getting fit, with those people then being kept ready and able to mobilise rapidly should the need arise. And that's a system that retains a high degree of public support in Switzerland. And that may be the crucial difference between the neutral country and Britain, and arguably the rest of Western Europe and United States as well. If our ability to avoid getting directly involved in armed conflict comes down to our ability to project strength to those who are inclined to take advantage of weakness, then you have to say things could get a touch sticky in the next couple of decades. Now, the EU has long been the place to look for big battles between bureaucrats who put their faith in precautionary legislation and the farmers, the industry sectors, the tech giants that end up impacted by all that legislation. Of course, when you make very strict rules in principle, you often find that in practice, pragmatists have to find ways to enforce such rules selectively just to make things work. And so it seems, this week a major secret legal opinion from 2022 was obtained by Politico, showing that the EU doesn't follow its own rules on approving pesticides. This comes down to a ruling by the European Court of Justice, which made the absolutist case that all pesticides sold on the EU market should be proven not to be toxic or carcinogenic in the long term. Why is that absolutist? Well, largely because proving a negative is an impossibly high bar, absence of evidence not being the same as evidence of absence, and also because it doesn't leave room for products to be safe if used as instructed, even though they might be hazardous if misused. Don't think that's a get-out-of-jail-free card, mind? According to studies, farmers are around 2.5 times more likely to develop Parkinson's disease than the rest of us and are more prone to cancer. That doesn't nail specific causes and effects in relation to one specific chemical, of course, but it's also not an argument for complacency. Now, the legal opinion found that given a certain amount of legal ambiguity, in practice, regulators are not always requiring pesticide companies to provide evidence to that high a level, possibly a reflection of the argument that, as worded, the judgment arbitrarily sets a bar that is just too high. But the wording is what it is. So, do you enforce the law as it's written, or don't you? The context for why this all matters is the ongoing fight over whether or not the weed killer glyphosate should be used. The EU recently infuriated anti-pesticide campaigners by approving the use of glyphosate for another 10 years. One of the most widely used chemicals in agriculture in the world, it has been a battleground in the EU in particular. Former temporary bans had been held by farmers to have caused huge damage to their crops given the lack of similarly effective alternatives. Meanwhile, in the United States, court cases have been ongoing against glyphosate manufacturer Bayer from litigants claiming that the chemical gave them cancer. The results of those lawsuits have been mixed. Bayer has won 10 and lost 5 of the last 15 trials. Various agencies have not supported the idea that glyphosate causes cancer, although some have come down on the opposite side as well. Just to make things more complicated, the US EPA said that it was, quote, not likely to be carcinogenic to humans, a statement that, it's worth noting, falls short of that absolute proof demanded by the EU court. An expert committee for the European Chemicals Agency also concluded that it was not justified to conclude that glyphosate causes cancer, which was a key part of the EU's recent decision. But again, it does not meet the absolutist terms of the legislation. So unsurprisingly, a raft of environmental campaign groups are now lining up to challenge the recent decision to allow the chemical. Central to their case is the contention that the EU's safety assessment of glyphosate relied too much on industry-funded studies while giving too little weight to independent research. Now, don't get too carried away. Certainly some criticisms have been made in the past, but such independent research is often just as prone to bias from activist scientists seeking to get the answer they want as the industry-funded stuff. So it is that you end up with something of a quagmire that most of us citizens can only look at from afar without having a clue to be able to really assess what is the quality of the evidence that actually counts. The agencies involved, the European Chemicals Agency and the European Food Safety Agency, both vigorously defend their work against the claims of the activists, for what that's worth. The question seems to rest on whether the letter of the law can be used to decide the case in the absence of any solid, uncontested proofs one way or another on the safety question. This argument doesn't exist in a vacuum. Right now, the EU is seeing a wave of protests in a number of countries, often led by farmers, pushing back against policies that are held to be out of touch with ordinary people. And that includes initiatives to radically reduce the use of pesticides, amongst other policies. Indeed, the coming EU parliamentary elections later in the year are highly expected to see a significant growth in representation on the political right as a result of all of this, as a pushback against what are seen as the Brussels technocrats. But the stage is set for this to play out at a high-level confrontation because this week it became clear that a number of the EU heavyweight members are not backing down in their environmental and particularly their climate ambitions. A letter to the Commission from a number of nations called for the retention of a highly ambitious climate target for 2040, including deep carbon emissions cuts. The group of 11 countries that wrote the letter includes Germany and France, the two largest economies, as well as the Netherlands, Spain, and a number of others. And it says this: the need for ambitious global climate action has never been more evident. We strongly encourage the European Commission in its upcoming communication to recommend an ambitious EU climate target for 2040. As things currently stand, it's expected that the European Commission will endorse a 90% emissions cut by 2040, which is an extremely ambitious target that will undoubtedly feed the various resistance movements as such a number are pulled out, probably both accurately and less accurately given how politics works these days. The added push probably comes as a response to the fact that the EU Science Advisory Body recently pointed out that the bloc is on track to miss its climate targets right now. It probably doesn't help things that by all accounts one of the highest profile transitions, that of road transport, seems to be hitting some pretty big obstacles. So in the UK, for instance, there have been a number of stories this week about fleet operators going into reverse gear on the purchase of electric vehicles. Addison Lee, for instance, that had made the decision to move its fleet towards being all electric as part of a programme to become net zero as a company by 2023, which was last year. The process started with ordering 1,000 EV Volkswagens, but that plan has now been abandoned, as support for such vehicles proves lower as expected, not least because charging infrastructure simply isn't ready for major expansions in numbers. And the chief executive of the company said this: "We were promised that the infrastructure would come on stream and facilitate the growing number of cars that were being added by the day. Unfortunately, the experience didn't quite match the vision." The rental car giant Hertz similarly has announced plans to sell off 20,000 electric vehicles to buy petrol engine cars instead. This comes from low uptake from drivers and falling used car prices, with EV prices down by over 10% across the year. And it's not just the UK. Swedish EV maker Polestar has announced 450 job cuts in the face of what it describes as challenging market conditions. And even Tesla saw its first ever drop in annual profits, largely as a result of a price war that it itself started in the failed bid to remain the biggest competitor in China. And speaking of China, lithium prices have plunged worldwide by as much as 80% in the face of slowing Chinese demand for, yes, electric vehicles. Manufacturers are struggling to remove a backlog in lithium as it is, so the miners are scaling back production plans until market conditions improve. And this has particularly been felt in Australia, which produces 40% of the world's lithium supplies. Various companies there have called a halt to operations and have seen company valuations drop significantly in the short term. Now, is this the death knell for the entire industry, as some political commentators are desperately hoping? Well, that is pretty unlikely. It does reflect that lithium remains an immature market, prone to major volatility in the early stages. Arguably, you could say that of the EV market as a whole. Apart from in Trump headquarters maybe, there's no sign that many expect the direction of travel to significantly shift, even if the speed of change and the bumpy headwinds en route turn out to be more difficult than expected. Analysts at Citi suggested to the Financial Times that the market was likely to rebound in the second half of this year. That's assuming we're not all in the trenches fighting Vladimir Putin by then, I suppose. My thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Without their support, these videos could not be made. If you would like to add your support, and it is always welcome and much needed, head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. There are other ways to support the channel that are given in the video description below. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.